Um, I'll try to, well, I've decided I'm not going to try and talk about Europe as a whole. I'll take the easy option. I'm going to talk about the country which I know the best, which is Britain. And I thought I'd just preface what I'm about to say with a few reflections on what was said this morning, because there were some really interesting points that were made. Particularly Musa's point about this risk of overemphasizing the Muslim dimension. And I realise that when we do this kind of research, we're always in this trap of not wanting to make too much of people's religiosity. You know, Hassan just pointed out that not all Muslims are mobilizing as Muslims, although at the same point, if we don't, at the same time, if we don't point out this, you know, different nature of political participation, there's not a lot to really discuss. So I'm very well aware that what I'm going to talk about today could be construed as looking at a Muslim dimension when actually there are other dimensions we could look at: ethnic, racial, immigration, etc. So I'm very much aware of that, but I think it is something we do need all to reflect upon. And so what I'm going to do is actually just give a brief overview of Muslim involvement in electoral politics in Britain over the last 30 to 40 years. So it's going to be, you know, a sort of a fly through recent history, because I think the British case is not unique in Europe, but certainly it's a different case because of the fact that, as was mentioned this morning, many migrants to Britain who arrived in the 50s and 60s from India and Pakistan, other areas of the Commonwealth, did of course arrive with full citizenship rights and full voting rights, and that makes a huge difference, and that explains why in Britain comparatively we have such a rich history of political participation, of people standing in elections, voting and the rest of it. Of course, that doesn't happen in every other European country. Still now, you know, in France, for example, immigrants do not have the right to vote in local elections, even though it's, you know, been promised periodically since the 80s, and I think even by Hollande in 2012, and it still hasn't been put into place. So that does make the British context rather unique in certain fashion. So I would argue that, you know, participation of Muslims in British politics starts as soon as the settlement starts, because of the fact that people had political rights and were able to vote. And it's been shown through many studies that people have taken that opportunity and made the most of it. So it may not be, you may not be aware that the first elected representative from a Muslim background in Britain, this dates back to 1970, so we're talking like a very long time ago, and that is the gentleman who's pictured there at the bottom on the left, Bashir Maan, who's something of a local celebrity, or certainly a pillar of the community in Glasgow, because he's had a very successful political career there. And it's actually interesting that Scotland is the place where we find both the first elected councillor, so i.e. the first person elected to local government from a Muslim background, and also the first member of Parliament. So I'm yet to discover, having lived in Scotland now for the past 3 or 4 years, I'm yet to discover what the reason for this is, but there's something interesting, I think, about that as well. So while in a lot of other countries we might be talking about involvement in politics as a more recent thing since maybe the 90s or 2000s, as people gained citizenship, gained voting rights, in Britain this dates back much, much longer. And certainly from the 1980s onwards, there was an increasing number of people who wanted to get involved in politics, joining political parties. Often this was a result of being involved in trade unions, for example. So many people who were active in their workplaces and unions found a natural route into the Labour Party. This is just one of the reasons why there's such a strong connection between voting Labour and Muslim communities in the UK, and we do have a lot of data now on that and the link between which parties are voted for and why. So already in the 1980s we had a significant number of people who were putting themselves forward to be elected at the local level, so this is local government. And usually this happened in places where we might imagine of high concentration of Muslim settlement. So the classic examples, not only London, but other major cities in Manchester, Birmingham, and Bradford as well. And the profile of these people were usually those, usually men, usually those who'd had maybe successful careers, and they had subsequently decided they wanted to get into local politics. At this time, you didn't actually get paid to be a local politician if you were in local government. So obviously that excluded a lot of people who would not normally be able to do it unless there was a salary. Of course, now there is. And so the profile of the individuals putting themselves forward was quite a common profile of usually male, usually within their sort of 60s, and those who were essentially wealthy enough to be able to have this as almost a kind of hobby. The first research that we have into this phenomenon of elected representatives from a Muslim background dates from the mid-90s. So a researcher who works at the University of Manchester, Kingsley Purdom, he was the first person to study Muslims as political actors as Muslims. So before this, all the research that we had was about ethnic and racial minorities. So whether, do black people participate in politics? Yes. Do they, who do they vote for? That started in the 80s. By the mid-90s, we have this first study of elected representatives based on their religious background. Okay? And as you can imagine, that kind of research, of course, has increased exponentially after 2001. So the researcher Purdom found out that by 1996 there were already 160 elected representatives, Muslim councillors, up and down the country, with 95% of them representing the Labour Party. So there's a very strong connection between Labour and Muslim communities. Here are just the breakdown of the figures. So unsurprisingly, London has the majority, or at least a third of those councillors, and then the rest are split up into the other major cities with large Muslim populations. And the research that Purdom did was also very interesting, because he interviewed these councillors and asked them about the way they got elected, how they went about getting people to vote for them. And many of them did admit to invoking loyalties amongst their community in terms of their kinship, the different ethnic groups. So this is something that's been talked about now a lot in the media, even today, but actually we know this since the mid-90s, but in the media they've only just managed to pick up on this recently. In fact, just to mention an example that happened a few weeks ago, there was a by-election in Oldham, which is a town just on the outskirts of Manchester, and this was a by-election in which UKIP, the UK Independence Party, was expected to perform quite well. In the end, they didn't win. It was a victory for the Labour candidate. But the UKIP party, they complained about the fact that supposedly Muslim voters of South Asian origin, were using postal votes inappropriately. So this is another aspect to Muslim political participation, which is something that is starting to be studied more now. Despite the fact that actually this has been happening for 20 years. So there is more interest now in the general media about the ways, different ways that politics sometimes happens in these areas. And then the latest figures that I have, which are of course not late at all, but I mean this is the only ones I could actually find, was the fact that by 2006 we've got to a similar number of Muslim councillors just in London as there was in 1996 throughout the whole country. So we can assume now that we're talking several hundreds of Muslims involved in local government. In terms of representation in Parliament, we find that the transition from being involved in local government to the national parliament was actually much tougher. Political parties were much more reluctant for many years to select candidates, not just those of Muslim background, but all kinds of candidates who weren't conforming to, let's say, the white British norm. The first ethnic minorities to be elected to the House of Commons were in 1987, but it wasn't until 1997 that we had the first elected politician to the House of Commons who was Muslim. And again, it's in Glasgow, in the largest city in Scotland, Mohammed Sarwar. So by the next time we had a general election coming along, which was 2001, this number doubled to 2, but also there was a significant increase in the number of candidates who were Muslim. Now, obviously, most of them were unsuccessful. There were 53 Muslim candidates amongst the more than 650 constituencies in the UK, but only 2 of them were actually selected. Then we see a process by where each year, essentially, the numbers tend to double. So from 2001 to 2005, it goes to from 2 to 4. From 2005 to 2010, it goes to 4 to 8. And last time, I mean, we had an election this year, 2015, and we now have 13 Muslim MPs. Now, of course, the question arises, what does it actually mean to be a Muslim MP? Some of these people are more likely than others to put forward the fact that they have maybe a Muslim religious identity. But I think what is interesting to point out is the fact that many of them are women. So one of the questions that's listed actually in our program here is about the role of women. Well, as we can see here, there's no issue in terms of female participation and getting elected, certainly in the UK. Women are very well represented, even to the extent that the Scottish National Party has a female Muslim representative. And also we can see that it's not just a Labour-dominated phenomenon. So whereas in the first early years, 97, 2001, even up to 2005, all Muslim members of Parliament were representing the Labour Party, now we also have representatives from the Conservatives and even the Scottish National Party, who of course now are by no means a minority party. They are the major party in Scotland, having well over 50 seats in Parliament. We also find representation within the upper chamber of our Parliament, in the House of Lords. These are politicians who are very much out of the public sphere and not so much quoted, for example, in the media. The exception to that would be Sayeeda Warsi, who's the lady pictured on the left, because she was part of the government and controversially resigned over its policy in Gaza, actually. So she would be the exception to that. But otherwise, these are politicians like the rest of the House of Lords, which most people do not know who they are and even what they do. So, but nevertheless, I think it's important to highlight the fact that they are there. Okay. Again, in the devolved legislatures as well that we have in the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, there are representatives who often do identify as being Muslim. This is not just other people projecting onto them a Muslim identity. This does actually apply to themselves as well. And Humza Yousaf, who's pictured there at the top, is very well known within the Scottish context, and has actually done a lot of work recently on behalf of the plight of Syrian refugees and trying to get the UK government to take more refugees from Syria. Another thing that's interesting about the British context is the array of initiatives that exist to try to specifically get Muslims to go out and vote, which I find rather curious, because actually all the research that we have shows that on the whole the turnout of Muslims is usually higher than the national average. So why there needs to be a campaign in order to get out the vote, to me seems a little bit strange. But nevertheless, the Muslim Council of Britain every year since 2005 has organised these campaigns in which it encourages Muslims to vote. Not only that, but also to think about how they vote and how that relates to their Muslim identity. So the Muslim Council of Britain will produce a document prior to the elections in which they encourage Muslims to think about the issues, and if you go on their website, you'll be able to find that document that they released for the 2015 election that happened in May of this year. But there are also different grassroots initiatives as well. So one particular example which I think is interesting is this one called YouElect, and this is very much a grassroots bottom-up initiative that was organised by several Muslim civil society organisations, and that started in 2010 for the elections then, and they organised lots of events to get people interested in the election, but also specifically try and bring together candidates, Muslim candidates for election, in order to debate the issues. And if we look at the poster on the right here, this is from a constituency in London, in East London, which has a very high percentage of people from a variety of backgrounds actually, but in particular it's well known that there is a large Bengali population, and it's no surprise that every single candidate there for all the major political parties does have a Muslim background. So political parties themselves recognise, or at least assume, that if they want to get elected in a constituency such as that, they would need to put forward a candidate who resembles the rest of the population. So I argue that parties are searching for a Muslim vote in some ways, but it's not quite clear what that actually is and whether it even really exists. But there's no doubt that political parties in the UK are trying to court Muslims as a constituency. That even the Conservative Party has its own little organisation called the Conservative Muslim Forum. Yes, I'll finish now. Explicitly designed to try and get more people to vote for their party. So I'll stop there because I realise I've now 0 minutes to finish. I was going to also include some reflections on the French case, but I'll leave it there. Maybe we can have that in the discussion. So thanks very much.